today we're going to look at how to estimate and find a percent of a number. But before we do, I want to just look at some benchmarks, some things that you should just memorize and have a feeling for. And if you look here, we have a half of a whole. And you should realize that 1/2 is the same as having 50% of something. The next one that you should recognize is 1/4 is the same as 25% of something. So 1/4 is the same as 25%. And 1/5, if I take 1/5, it's the same as 20% of a number. And finally, 1/10 is the same as 10% of a number. If you're not sure how this works, let's look at it. First, when we're converting fractions to a percent, we have to convert them to 100ths. So this would be 50 100ths, which is the same as 50%. The next one, convert to 100ths. 4 times 25 is 100. So you're going to get 25 100ths, which is the same as 25%. 1/5, convert that to hundredths. 5 times 20 is 100. So you're going to get 20 100ths, which is 20%. And finally, 1/10, convert that to hundredths times 10, and that is 10%. But like I said, these are some fractions that you should have memorized and be able to convert pretty quickly between the fraction and the percent of a number. Sometimes when you're shopping, you'll see a sale and it might say something like 30% off. And you should be able to figure out what is 30% of something. And this is what we're going to learn today. So let's say that the item you wanted to buy was $80 and the sign said you're going to get 30% off. What is 30% of 80? There's a couple of ways that we can do this. 30% is the same as 3/10, okay? And the number that we're working with is 80. So what we want to figure out is, we're not converting it to hundreds because we're trying to find out the $80. So 10 times what was the 80 times 8. So we're going to do the same thing to the numerator, times 8. And 3 times 8 is 24. So if something was 30% off and the item cost $80, you would be getting a discount of $24. So $24 is the answer. What is 30% of 80? That's not the price you're going to pay though. There would be one more step. You would have to take the $80, subtract the 30%, which is the $24, and find out what type of a discount you're going to get. Now you're going to only pay $56 instead of $80. There's another way to figure out what is 30% of 80, and this might be an easier way. When we look at a number like this, do something that is simpler. Could you tell me what 10% of 80 is? Well, 1/10 of 80 would be taking that 80 and dividing it by 10. So we know how to divide by 10. We just move the decimal one spot to the left. So 10% of 80 is 8. Now, knowing that, could you figure out what 30% would be? Well, you're going to do 10% 3 times. So 8, another 10%, and another 10%. Add those up. 8 times 3 is 24, which is the same answer we got the other way. There's just 2 ways of doing it. Some people like to do it this way because they find it easier to work with tens, which I sometimes agree. Let's look at another example. What if I asked you to find 25% of 200? So based on the percentages, you should know that 25% is the same as what fraction? it's the same as 25 over 100, or it's the same as 1/4. But in this case, we're trying to find out what the 25% of 200 is. So we put the 200 on the bottom in the numerator spot, and we try and figure it out like this. 100 times what equals 200? So do the same thing to the top. So 25% of 200 is 50, as you can see here. Another way of doing it would be to figure out what's half of 200. So if we could figure out 50% of 200, 50% you should recognize as being half. So if you could figure out 50% of 200, split it in half, and that would be 100. And then to split it in half again to find 25%, you would get the same answer. You would get 50. So there's no perfect way of doing it. It's about doing it, but being able to do it quickly and preferably in your head. Now, what if you were required to estimate a percentage? Maybe it's not going to be the exact number, but it's going to be an estimate. If I said to you, 14 students in the class are girls, and there are 30 students altogether. 30 students altogether. And I said to you, estimate the percentage of girls in the class. Well, we have some benchmarks. 50% would be half. And so what would half of 30 be? Well, 1/2 of 30 would be 15. So could we say about 50% of the students are girls? Yes, we could, because it's an estimate. Always use the word about when you're doing an estimate. So about 50% are girls. Don't forget your sentence for a word problem. What if I asked you what percent of these circles are red? Well, you could start by figuring out the fraction. So how many dots are there all together? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 dots all together. How many of them are red? 4. So 4/16 are red. Now, if we want to convert that to a percent, it doesn't work well because you can't do 16 times something to get to 100. So what you need to do is reduce this to lowest terms first. So 4 goes into 4 one time, and 4 goes into 16 4 times. Now we can convert it to a percent. As you can see, 4 times 25 and 1 times 25. So what would we say? About 25% are red. There would be another way of doing it. Instead of trying to convert it, just picture it. Instead of converting it to a fraction, you can see visually that 1/4 of the counters are red, and you should recognize that 1/4 is the same as 25%. Now, when we're estimating, everything is not always going to work out perfectly. So that's why it's called an estimate. We can say the word about. If I asked you what's 10% of 80, you could figure that out by doing 80 divided by 10, and you would get 8. 10% of 80. But what if the question says what's 9% of 80? Well, 9% and 10% are not that far off. So you could say about, excuse me, I don't have enough space, but you would say, put the decimal here, about 8. What if the question says, what's 51% of 140? Well, let's just figure out what 50% would be. What would half of 140 be? 70. So we can say about 70. What about this one? 19% of 75. This one's a little trickier, but let's think of it in terms of tens. So what would 10% of 75 be? You're dividing it by 10, so you're moving the decimal one spot. So 10% would be 7.5. Add another 10% onto that. That's your 20%. This is 19. So add those together, and you get 15. So you could say 19% of 75 is about 15. It's not exactly, but it's about 15 because that's 20%.